In this video, I would like to discuss a comment that I received. This commenter brought up an incredibly important point that is often overlooked or unperceived by some of those that are expanding themselves or are working in any way towards personal growth. For this reason, I feel that this latest question is a very important one, not only in relation to the techniques that I discuss as an inner alchemist, but also in relation to human psychology in general, and how it is that we explore and work with the only part of us that really matters in the end, and that is our inner reality, our psyche. In this case, the commenter wanted to ask me about how to develop, or what my thoughts were on developing and restructuring aspects of the psyche. How this person put it is that they wanted to know about the development of a different identity type, a new identity, one more in line with expanded awareness, and the work and mindset that is needed as one engages in inner alchemy. They wanted to know basically how it is possible to disconnect with these old identities, and what might be a good process for restructuring them, or creating new ones, so that these then become beneficial going forward, specifically in the techniques and work related to the way of the Projectionist, which is my latest book on the complexities of inner alchemy. My response is as follows. In discussing the inner psyche, our personal psychology, our inner subjective experience, there are many different terms that we can and do use. The fact that there are many terms is not often an asset, and in reality, I believe, that this in many ways unstructured path to inner work, which borders on the chaotic, is really a sign of how little time we have spent as a society on working with our inner reality. It is often the case that when speaking of the many layers of the self, and the expanding and the redirecting of the attention of the self, we use terms such as identity or personality. We love to compartmentalize our inner self, and create blocks and sections that are further divided into polarities, that is, compartmentalized blocks of self that have very distinct and rigid boundary lines and differentiations. For example, as this commenter has done, we may speak of how we were something in the past and how we wish to be something else in the future. As such, we may say that a different personality or identity was responsible for this outcome in our past, and that in order to create a new and better outcome, we need to create a new identity that can deal with, or that is able to work towards creating, the reality that we now want. It is even possible that we may say that it is only a new identity or personality, a new kind of self, that will be able to deal with, and live, exist and thrive, within the current paradigm created. We therefore posit that only a certain type of self can exist within this new environment, while the other personality, the personality of the past that we once were, could not exist nor maintain this new segment of personal becoming. While using such words to define aspects of ourselves as we grow, is not wrong, and indeed can help us to better define the processes that we may perceive to be going on in our mind, such definitions can also be a great hindrance, because they naturally create internal walls that limit the growth of our intellect. There are many segments, many different paths and facets, that are involved in my teachings that I have not had the time to explore with my readers in great detail, but that are nevertheless present and represent a very important features of inner alchemy. One of these incredibly important aspects is the structure, or that is destructuring, of the mind, of the developing entity that I referred to as the ghost in the machine in the book that this commenter is referencing, The Way of the Projectionist. Such a developing entity, this ghost in the machine, which is of the greatest importance to the inner alchemist, is in a constant state of the coming and growing, and it is therefore very important that this destructuring take place as the alchemist grows in power. Such expansion, even though it does not take up space, as we understand expansion in physical terms, is the one key factor that represents our ability to grow beyond the limits of the cage that we are bound to while physically alive. As this ghost expands through any kind of experience as we age, there is a natural tendency, sometimes advocated by modern psychology, that posits that we should create frameworks, walls and separations, within that expanding inner space. While the desire to create a framework through the use of walls and structures that we are used to in physical reality might seem quite reasonable, the truth is that this expansion is, due to the fact that in reality it does not take up physical space, limiting this inner world, limiting human potential. This inner dimension that is expanding is free of the three-dimensional boundaries that so bind us in current physical reality, and unfortunately, being that the physical is the only reference that we all share to a great degree, we like to compartmentalize and create a kind of structure that, while helpful in the beginning as our intellect begins to grow, as our ghost in the machine grows, can in time limit truly large expansions of the self. The point of this video then is to provide a different kind of way to deal with the expanding psyche, this ghost in the machine. And I think that this alternate to structuring, that goes against the compartmentalization through boundaries and walls, can be an incredibly powerful asset to not only those that are working on occult material, but those that are working on any kind of interpersonal growth, any kind of inner work that causes for them a feeling of expansion of mind and self. Now, the typical way to see the self is to see it as a bunch of personalities that are in conjunction to each other. As such, we often see this structure of ourselves as being sort of like different rooms, and all of these rooms together make up the person that we call our total self, with one particular room, or identity, being the forefront of the current personality type at any one point in time. Depending on the complexity of any particular person's intellect, this structure can be seen as being quite large or quite small, either a small house or a large mansion, as it were. It is also the case that even though our inner world may be quite large, containing many rooms and many identities, we may often use one or perhaps two rooms for the most part. We may even see certain rooms, certain selves or identities, as being dark and dangerous, and as such these walled off and pushed back compartmentalizations are kept hidden, so that these rooms therefore become dark basements that we are afraid to look at, or to run into in any way. There are other ways to structure the self, this totality of whole self or psyche. Within the scope of inner alchemy, for example, it is far better to imagine the expanding self, the expanding ghost in the machine, as a type of sphere if you like, as opposed to a multi-leveled mansion. You could also, if you like, think of the self as being a type of platter, as opposed to a mansion of rooms or a straight line of growth and evolution. In that way, what you were in the past and what you are now are on the same level, together, as opposed to separated entities by time. Everything then is on the platter together. In this way, all aspects of this self are therefore directly connected, and there is no divisions created by an outer physical self that is used to seeing the world bound within the constricting forces of a three-dimensional view of the world, as a cube within a cube, within a cube. When you can restructure your identification with the evolving self in this manner, you can see that the person that you were, and the person that you want to be, or are becoming, are not separated aspects of some intricate maze, but are in fact a conglomeration, a highly connected, dare I say it, divine, whole entity whose complexity grows not by dividing itself and compartmentalizing itself, but by growing in unified and holistic complexity. The person that you were when you were a child, for example, as you look back through time, might seem so different from you as to be a different person, a different identity. There is sometimes this natural inclination to separate yourself from that other perceived self of the past, to say that that person that you were back then could never deal with the things that you are dealing with now, because that other self lacked the knowledge and experience that you have now. But, if you see your inner reality as a totally different dimension, that is not bound by linear time and physical space, as is your current three-dimensional and objective self, with a past identity that is separated and boxed off from the other, then, that past child self is not far away from you, at least not in the way that you imagine it to be, and is instead ever present and a vital and still active part of you now. In that way, that past self is still alive, effective, evolving, and it can, and should be allowed to, add to the power of the whole, instead of being put away like something that is no longer needed, alive, or evolving still. And by doing so you realize that that other earlier identity had, and has, many positive, and incredibly powerful capabilities, that are as useful, and can be used fully now, to better your entire being, your complete entity, your total self. In this way, all the aspects of self grow, and intermingle and share. This evolving total self, that you are, grows in power, which from a rational perspective could be thought of as a geometric growth in intellect, as opposed to further division and partition-created complications that those partitions incur within an evolving and aging individuality. So to the original question then, how is it that we develop a new identity in order to deal with the new powerful challenges found within the study of inner alchemy? Well, what we need to do then is not to create new identities. We should not create new compartmentalizations. Instead, we should work towards breaking down the barriers of the many selves that make up our entire I amness. The quest of alchemy is to break apart the cube, as opposed to creating more and more cubes within ourselves. We therefore do not create something new by creating and compartmentalizing a new section inside ourselves, and trying to fill that new space, that perceived space within ourselves that does not exist, because again, inner reality is beyond physical space. Instead, we throw down the walls of division, and we allow this ever-evolving complexity that is now free to quite naturally develop itself and create its own structures that are beyond physical conception of structures. This natural reordering that saves our past, but creates newness without division, will then begin to pool the great resources that are now available to the whole undivided self. This whole being then becomes quite naturally a more powerful entity. The intellect of the whole grows therefore, and continues to grow, as it borrows from its own grand reservoir of memory and collected experience, which continues beyond our idea of a beginning and an end by the way, to flower such wholeness into a new and complex intellect. So, my answer to the question is not to make more division, but instead to break it down. To do this, remember your past, all of it, look back at it, and at the person you were and are now. Try to forget nothing, but look at it all in perfect serenity, in perfect emotional containment, and that act alone, that expanded focus on all, as opposed to on just creating a barrier and focusing on one branch or one room of the whole self, will begin the process of bringing down the barriers and uniting the whole. To begin this process, it is very important to master the reabsorption techniques that I mention in my book, the Magnum Opus, as emotional weight, when looking at the past, can be draining, and this emotional weight must be as clear as possible therefore. Such a look back into what you perceive as a past in physical terms will erase those terms as you learn to fly, to project, deeply into your inner reality. Union will happen, quite naturally, and this union and expansion of experience through the rediscovery of your own wholeness, will broaden you, mature you in a way, in a positive way, that will, if done properly, lead to a greater becoming. From the perspective of the inner alchemist, the growth of the intellect, in accordance with inner alchemy's definition of it, which is to say a whole self without barriers, is far more important than the modern definition and measurement of general intelligence, in that it is the expansion and the natural growth of the intellect that develops true genius.